taco free.
Okay, guys, welcome back from lunch. We're going to get things going here with the start of our afternoon sessions. And again, just some housekeeping things. If you guys haven't downloaded the F3 app yet, flip your badge over, go ahead and get that downloaded. Again, it's F3, it's the green logo, and it's the 2025 app. That will have details about what to expect for tomorrow and for Wednesday's event. Coming up this afternoon, we're going to have a market update to kick things off, and then we'll take a pretty big networking break. When we take that networking break, there's going to be some of our thought leaders from SONAR just sprinkled across the room. There will be a little table tent that'll tell you, what table to go to if you want automotive and tires. You're going to talk to Thomas over there. If you want to talk about intermodal, you're going to talk to Mike over there. They'll be around the table. So just, again, get up and make sure that you find your way around the room. And then after that today, we will have a couple more fireside chats. We'll break for a happy hour, and then we'll get back together for our shipper of choice dinner this evening. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and kick things off for the afternoon with a market update. And if you are a SONAR customer, well, then you probably are in these updates all the time. If you're not, you should talk to one of our reps and you should become a SONAR customer. So here to talk a little bit about what's actually going on with the market right now, please welcome our head of freight market intelligence, Zach Strickland, our head of intermodal solutions, Mike Bowden-Distel, and our freight market expert, Thomas Wasson.
There we go. All right. Thank you, and welcome to the after lunch talk about data that will keep all of you on the edge of your seats. Thank you for coming out here today. Thank you for listening. We're gonna build on a few things that we've already heard a little bit today. How many people in the room have heard about there potentially being a capacity issue in the trucking market? Quite a few. I mean, before today, quite a few. So I know we've been talking about it for over a year now. Craig and myself, we've kind of talked about this transitional state that the truckload market is in. We're not just going to talk about the truckload market today, though. We're going to talk about most of the modes involved in the supply chain itself. We're going to start our way all the way in the maritime sector internationally, and we're going to work our way down into the domestic freight market, talking about intermodal, and then of course the capacity crunch potential and what that actually means. We're going to unpack what this non-domiciled CDL in a little bit more detail than you've probably heard. Thomas Wasson, of course, and I have had lots of discussions about this. He has done significant amount of work unpacking a lot of this data and what it actually could mean for the overall transportation market. So let's get things started with none other than some data. If I can get my computer clicker to work. There we go. All right. We'll just start here. So the IOTI, is there anybody in here that's familiar with this index? All right, we got a few. So Import Ocean TEU's volume index. This is a measure of demand, pure demand. What we've been dealing with this year, I feel like this chart probably makes more sense to this room than any other chart that we have because it has been broken from seasonality. We have really deviated from the traditional seasonal patterns, starting in about, April-ish. You can see this little hump in the white line there. And that is a sharp uptick. We had Liberation Day in April. It wasn't necessarily that sharp compared to the big recovery bump and early peak season volume we saw in June. If you were looking at this chart pre-pandemic, I only have, unfortunately, the post-pandemic lines on here. But if you were looking at this pre-pandemic, traditionally what you would see is a lump around late August, early September potentially, traditional peak season. If you think about this in the context of supply chains and retail, most of you are familiar with this kind of industrial pattern. We kind of got lulled into a very seasonal flow of things before COVID. COVID broke a lot of that apart. We thought we were going to get back to a more regular pattern, and that is still not true as of 2025. So a few years removed, and of course we've had some interesting developments this year with the tariffs. But this chart right here shows you what the shipping community has had to deal with. This is probably one of the largest, most challenging environments that I've experienced in terms of understanding shipping patterns and trade routes and policy outside of the COVID stuff, which was really just driven by stimulus, economic demand. that was a pure demand side event. This is a bit of a push and pull on demand. And that's what makes this environment so challenging and so unique and so almost awful to deal with from a demand forecasting perspective. A little bit harder to deal with than what we had in COVID, in the sense that I could forecast a 15% demand growth in COVID, missed to the low side, and that was awful, but I still was getting a lot of demand. The supply chain challenges were the pure problem there. Now we have some economic push and pull that we're going to go through. So, Mike, you're our resident maritime guy. You talk obviously in the rail side a little bit more. What are some of the factors that you see from the maritime side moving forward as we talk about this erratic demand and the policy? Obviously the tariffs have had some outsized influence here. What are we thinking about moving forward as we're starting to navigate this maritime space?
It should be a really weak fourth quarter, I think, is the expectation. So what we're looking at here in this IOTI is bookings at the point of origin, and they've really have been strong ever since kind of the middle part of last year, when people were concerned about the ILA labor situation, and a lot of the strength continued. Later in last year, it was a very difficult fourth quarter comp, and then you've had all the volatility this year in response to an anticipation of tariffs. And like you mentioned, you had that peak right at the beginning of July that was very unusual. But one thing I want to call out on that chart is normally right before China's Golden Week, which Golden Week is first week of October, you would have had a spike in the bookings, like you see in that green line, which is last year. You saw a spike right at the end of September. You also saw it to a lesser extent the previous year in 2023. Did not see that this year. There really wasn't that degree of demand, and a lot of that is because a lot of these maritime imports were pulled forward. The warehouses still has a lot of inventory in a lot of these upstream warehouses. So as far as this is related to international intermodal, was just writing about this from one of the reports that goes out tomorrow, is the expectation is that the fourth quarter is going to be very weak against difficult comps.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our users and people that I've talked to kind of use this index here as a kind of a centralizing demand forecast kind of point that they look at, saying, okay, we're forecasting 10 to 15% growth next year. Does that make sense in the context of the overall market in terms of goods demand, of course, because this is container volumes. It does not involve tank or any of the liquid stuff, but it is a nice economic indicator in the way that what are other shippers, what are other people thinking about moving into the next part of the year? Because a lot of this freight, of course, as a lot of people in this room know, is brought in well in front of expected demand. So the way I used to look at this was, and we've had some movement back and forth, but what are shippers thinking about their demand for the next 6 to 8 weeks? And of course, when we're looking at peak season year over year, what are they thinking about in terms of demand year over year, in terms of growth there? So it's not as straightforward as that when we're talking about trade policy and people moving freight from, different parts of the world now. Reshoring is now becoming a thing that's, still top of mind, but still not quite straightforward. It's still a pretty good indicator of what's the shipping community doing. Like, are we thinking that inventories are going to grow significantly for the next couple of weeks? Absolutely not. Looks like a lot of the inventories are where shippers feel comfortable with. They're not trying to outperform or get, that over ordering segment that we've seen in the last couple of years where they just order just in case. Warehousing costs, absolutely a factor through the roof. Inventory costs in general are increasing significantly. So this chart is really telling me that that muted expectation is really what we should expect from a demand aspect. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a soft environment from a transportation standpoint and procurement standpoint. The chart that I don't have on here that I wish I had, because I built these before it happened, was the spot rates for maritime. And we saw a pretty decent little jump in the maritime spot rates last week. This was scheduled, this was forecasted to happen. But we did have the fees, Mike, that we were supposed to go through just recently. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the maritime charges for non-U.S. owned and operated vessels, I think it's up to 50 pounds per ton or something like that. Scheduled to go into effect last week. That could be a relation to that. I don't know. Mike, what do you think here?
Well, it sounds like those fees really weren't being passed along. I mean, to a large extent, the vessels were able to be redeployed in such a way that they didn't have to pay a lot of those fees. So it doesn't seem like that's something that shippers are having to contend with, just yet. I mean, I think the general trend, though, in the spot rates and ocean rates is down because, I mean, you already talked through demand. But on the capacity side, there was a lot of capacity that was ordered during the pandemic when the carriers were making so much money that it's going to be in excess. You do see the carriers trying to manage down capacity by blanking sailings and by redeploying that capacity, because really the weakest trade lane in the world is China, the US right now. So they're trying to redeploy that from, say, China to Europe. I mean, those volumes aren't great, but they're a lot better than China to the US.
Yeah. So what do we think about managing that capacity moving forward? Do you think that it's going to have a meaningful influence? I mean, seeing that demand is down, yet we still have spot rates, at least, not contract rates, jumping up.
I do think it'll have a meaningful influence, but I'm not expecting any major bounce in rates that's sustainable.
Right.
Because the demand situation is not there. It's really kind of one of their core maritime lanes is going from China to the US. But I do think you'll see things like carriers blanking sailings, maybe some slow steaming, those type of things to manage down the capacity level. But if you're a shipper and looking at that and saying you're seeing your container getting rolled to the next vessel or rejected, like I wouldn't panic and accept the higher rate necessarily. I would just sort of with the context of there is plenty of capacity out there.
Yeah. So my takeaway there, though, is service is probably not going to be as stellar as it once was. Correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So even though service may fall apart, as carriers have less freight to move, the old saying is freight moves freight. They have to change their networks, and something we're going to, break into here in a minute, especially on the truckload side, where it becomes more apparent. Carrier network shifts. That's where you feel some of these temporary network disruptions when you're shipping freight, and it's going to be something that the shipping community is more than likely going to encounter more frequently, especially over the next 12 months, just because we have seen such a punishing amount of downturn in the demand side from that sector. So moving into the domestic side, now this chart is here to show that, supply chains have gotten more intelligent, they're more flexible since the pandemic. Instead of just leaning completely on the truckload market, a lot of the volume has shifted to intermodal. And this has been a modal shift. It's really largely taken away the transcontinental freight moves because it's cheaper, it's a little bit slower, but the shipping community has not seemed to mind. It's almost been a benefit, especially this time last year, where they were pulling a lot of inventory forward. This pull forward mechanism and ordering ahead of time, preemptive ordering, it gives a lot more time for freight to move domestically. So that means that they have more options. They're not leaning on that point A to point B shipping as much as they used to. And even though this has been largely the story of a modal shift from about the midpoint of 2024 till I would argue somewhere in February, March, we have started to see some total economic kind of deterioration in this demand component. Now, some of that, it's not to be alarming about, economic downturn. It is simply stating that we're seeing less than we did this time last year in total. And total freight demand being down off of a pull forward event is not that's not necessarily a negative economic signal. So I don't want people to overreact to the fact that we are starting to see some overall downturn here. But intermodal taking share is helping keep the truckload market softer for longer. And if we see a lot of people in this room start to move their freight back to the truckload market, that could have a very strong and potentially severe influence on domestic truckload shipping, because their networks, like I talked about, have been adapting to this low West Coast demand environment, with a lot of the freight moves being focused on the East Coast around the cities. Where that, again, outbound tender volumes, truckload market down. The white line is this year, and you can see it's right in line with 2018 and 2019. This is why the truckload carriers They're managing down their costs. They're shifting their networks down. This is effectively 7 years of demand that has just been pulled out of the market in a year. We're 15 to 20% down. This is what carriers are talking about when they're not feeling that this market is tight, because there's a lot less demand moving on the truck. Doesn't explain the whole story because of the chart I just showed you with the intermodal. Tender rejection rates. Now, Thomas, I'm going to start picking on you a little bit more here. Tender rejection rates. This is a very contract-centric data set. This is, larger shipper, larger carrier, EDI transmission saying, will you carry this load for me? Point A to point B. If they reject more of the freight, the market's tighter. This is a much more precise measure of market tightening or loosening than a spot rate is. If you think about all the stuff that goes into spot rates, you're talking about various operators' operating costs. You've got people that are willing, they don't have a ton of overhead, so they don't have to pass that along. Tender rejection rates don't have any of that. That's simply a yes or no, a binary situation where they're going to take the freight or not based on a determined rate, a predetermined rate. They don't like to turn freight down from their existing clients and shippers, their customers, especially in an environment like this one. So when they do start saying no more often, that is a sign that there is just financially, they have to. There's not a lot of opportunity there for them. So the fact that we're seeing rejection rates increase, I just talked about a 15 to 20% downturn in demand. Economically speaking, carriers are struggling. Carriers, brokers, the transportation sector, 3 years downturn. So through that, we're seeing capacity really bleed off. And before the ELPs and the non-domiciled stuff and all the headlines from immigration were happening, this was a big and probably a huge, like a much larger factor than any of this, rhetoric around the immigration and, the legal and illegal driver situation. Last year, we saw tender rejection rates really take off. And for the first time in several years, you can see that they're trending higher. Now, demand is down. And I think we heard, JB Hunt already talked about how that's kind of stalled out the freight market's turn. Thomas, my question to you, as we kind of enter a new era here, is what are carriers and brokers and transportation service providers dealing with now in terms of another potential headwind in this capacity? They're still kind of deteriorating in terms of overall capacity, but is there a new layer to this now with all the new non-domiciled stuff with the immigration?
Yeah, definitely is. When we're looking at this, I'm going to reference this chart here. The first thing I want to think about is elasticity. And so when I used to do fleet operations prior to being at FreightWaves, a lot of customers, 95% tender compliance. More stricter customers, 98, 99% tender compliance. So when you see an outbound tender rejection rate of 5%, I like to think of kind of in the money. If it's 2 to 4%, sometimes 2 to 3%, I like to think of auto accept hungry hippos. Take it all. I need it. I've got holes in my routing guide. I'm also putting in, having to fill my mix with spot. The ELP is an extra wrinkle because if you look at right now, we are outperforming. We're in line with seasonal expectations, but better on year-over-year comps. But the challenge is that normally truckload cycles are very demand driven. It's very unusual to have a situation where something happens to supply. One of the largest supply events that impacted the nature of trucking was the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, which saw broader deregulation across the board. We go to a cent per mile, cost per mile, compared to a formerly unionized one. The ELP mandate is one of the very few instances in recent memory where we have seen the federal government decide to take actions against a subset of truckload capacity and, keyword, attempt to vigorously enforce it. That's going to be one of the big topics here. So, when I'm looking at this, before I dive into specifically with ELP and as well as non-domiciled, one of the big things I want to highlight is trucking has been buffeted by 3 big things. The first one, intermodal. Things are not in a hurry, so I can put it on a train. That is not good for me in the truckload space, especially in areas like California where 70% goes on intermodal to begin with. There's no spillover. I'm kind of like a catfish in some of these markets. I'm not getting anything. The second big challenge is the for-hire space versus private fleets. If you look at the movement since 2017, private fleets went from 67% of all outbound loads to now approximately 74 to 75%. This is a trend that predated COVID because they got burned in the last cycle, and they said never again. Now, when we're looking at inbound volumes, we've also seen an increase. It's up to around 46% of all inbound volumes are now being covered by private fleets as well. So we have so many headwinds in terms of both modal competition and for hire and private. So what makes this non-domicile thing really special? So I'm going to give you the lowdown first. A non-domiciled CDL is just a fancy way of saying that I'm not from the state. Back in the good old days, Thomas may have got his CDL in Indiana, but he lives in Tennessee. So I get my little CLP in Indiana. I come down to Tennessee. I switch it out. I now have my domiciled CDL. But in the meantime, it was a form of non-domiciled. It worked out a lot if you're working in like Arkansas, but your motor carrier's in Texas and you're doing stuff. Well, that's a little S. In the past 10 or 15 years, we've, expansions of NAFTA, Mexican motor carriers and Canadians get more access broadly into the country. Non-domicile extends into big S, which is states that are not Mexico and Canada because of CDL reciprocity. So now that we have a little bit of a backstory, what does that mean? Well, FMCSA and DOT said there are approximately, 200,000 non-domiciled CDLs representing approximately 5% of interstate for hire. It's a statistically significant number. Now, with this new rulemaking, it has made some wrinkles that before did not used to be a problem. So those of you who have fleets, large fleets, talk to your safety and compliance specialist in your safety department. Ask how their day is doing, because right now their day is probably not as fun. So we have some key wrinkles here that I want you to think about. The first one is if I have a green card or an asylum status, I'm still good. I'm a permanent lawful resident. I'm permanent asylum set up. I can get my non-domicile. I can renew it. The problem is if I have a work authorization document and I am pending my green card and pending my asylum. That is called an E8 and an E9 EAD, Employment Authorization Document. Doesn't seem like a big deal until anecdotally one 600 truck count carrier out of Illinois that exclusively uses non-domiciled CDLs now has sidelined 200 of their drivers because they are E8 and E9 drivers. 1/3 of their capacity has now just stopped and it cannot go back on. Now, you can try to get around that if your states are under a temporary TLP status through the Department of State, where the Department of State says that your country is so crappy, I'm just not going to send you back. But the fear is of now with additional English language proficiency, we have what's called this wombo combo. And so drivers are fearful because they don't want to be deported if they have a newly or no longer valid work visa. That's the easiest way to get sent out. The second problem, for your drivers who do have the right employment document, the cruel punchline of the joke is now with English language proficiency, you can now get placed out of service. That's a problem. That messes with your safety scores, your ISRs and your other stuff. The worse your score is, the more Uncle Sam wants to look at you. And then also the worse your score is, the worse brokers want to look at you because they think that you're doing sketchy stuff. So we have right now the makings of this capacity crunch. We know statistically that this is going to be a problem. But as you look in this data set here, we see in both spot market and outbound tender rejection rates, so far the market appears to be in the early signs of a bifurcation. I like to think of it as like the spot market is the very first dog in the sled, and we're doing an Iditarod race, and it generally moves the broader contract space by about 30 to 90 days. And so when we're looking at these trends in the past 7 days, we have seen a notable out-of-season jump in spot market rates. The only information we have that could have caused that is the increased fear of or the actual enactment of these things. And so the other challenge is finally is that we have a lot of noise. I'm going to call this the fog of war because right now we are typically entering trucking's peak season. So I want to caution everybody that, when we're looking at these data sets, we also have to make the very tough decision of threading a needle to answer the question, is the market improving because there's 20% less supply in terms of outbound tender volumes, and then there's an elevated amount of tender ejection rates, meaning fertile ground. We did not have any hurricanes to test market elasticity, or is this something where there's going to be a broader structural trend? In my personal opinion, there will be broader structural trends that we cannot, we have to take into consideration, and that I do believe that this will cause, a meaningful uptick in rates and tightening of capacity due to regulatory oversight.
Yeah, so if you guys need a chart or something to look at in terms of how can demand going down produce a tighter environment, this is the chart for you. Tender volumes represented there in the white. You can see throughout this year, they've been coming down. Now, multiple reasons for that. You've got the pull forward erosion, you've got intermodal taking some share, and you've got a little bit of economic deterioration going on. Tender rejection rates in the green have come up. And, the theory here is, what if demand had remained in play for this market? Now, a lot of this has nothing to do with the tariffs in a direct fashion because of the modal conversion component that was started last year. And a lot of that was driven by the Red Sea and the uncertainty around a lot of the shipping lanes there. And then it just kind of got a continuation. So tender rejection rates going from 4-ish% to around 6%, most people in this room aren't going to care. There's two reasons for that. One, that's not a huge jump. You're losing an extra load or two per every 100 loads that you're tendering out. That's not going to make your week or month that much worse. However, the other component of this is the fact that, it's more about service than it is about rate. And you don't need strong sets of service right now. You actually just need the freight in the country ready to ship when you need it. So tender rejection rates going up from 4 to 6% is more of a precursor. It's kind of that warning sign before the volcano could potentially erupt. Looked like it was going to in November of last year. That's why, Craig and I got up and talked about it, because tender rejection rates jumping over 10% was a big deal. That was the first sign that we had 10% plus tender rejections. That is a tight signal. That is where rates inflate meaningfully. The point where we see sustained tender rejection rates and inflation start to really matter is right around that 8-9% line. That's where the shipping community really starts to bid against each other and say, I don't like this service. This is unacceptable. I'm now getting freight piling up on my dock. I need to move it more consistently and more reliably. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but the tender rejection rate is showing us that is happening. It's just happening very, very, very slowly. Contract rates. Now, Thomas, you mentioned a thing. So you're looking at a chart of spot rates, removing fuel costs above $1.20 per gallon, about the equivalent of a standard fuel surcharge in orange. Go Vols. And then you've got the white line there, which is the contract rate. Contract rates are far more stable. These are 12-month rates for the most part. The pandemic, that kind of broke apart. Contracts became completely useless for any length of time because there's just not enough capacity to meet the demand. That's what you see there in that mountain. We don't expect mountains to occur in the contract rate market. We do expect volatility to occur in the orange line there with the spot rate. Thomas, you mentioned we saw spot rates jump up last week or 2 weeks ago. And there was no sign in the tender data at that point in time. A lot of this rhetoric around the non-domiciled and the immigration and the ELP, that's like small carrier centric stuff from what most people think about. How can this, and you just talked about a 600, fleet carrier as being one that got targeted. How do you think that this plays out in a small versus large carrier? Is there a difference here? And do we start to see that spot rate, volatility manifest into something a little bit larger?
So my initial research was this is going to be isolated to spot market carriers. Typically, they don't have access. They're utilizing or specialize in non-domiciled CDLs. It's similar to how some carriers will specialize in buying used trucks between the ages of 4 and 7. Everyone has their niche. Larger truckload carriers who are also utilize non-domiciled CDLs. Now, as a percentage of the mix of total drivers, that's the challenging question. Typically, we could assume that the large carriers, some call them mega carriers or national carriers, they have a safety and compliance team. They have recruiting departments. They're vetting these drivers. I'm generally not worried about the status of it. They'll continue to utilize drivers of various types because they have a high turnover and you got to fill the bucket. these small fleets represent one of the big challenges because as you look at the contract spread right there, the initial base rate per mile, I like Werner's CEO, Derek Leathers, his earnings commentary. There's a few other ones as well talking about the gains on their RFPs, kind of like we can get 3 to 5% or low to medium single digits. Well, the problem is you look there, that line's nearly flat. But we also had a really great presentation with some ATRI and other data sets where it showed your costs are going up around that 3, 5, or 7%. And so the cruel irony right now in the contract space is yeah, you can get an extra like 5% on your RFP. Congratulations. But now you're back where you started on this hamster wheel because your costs have meaningfully increased. And so what we're looking at, and the key thing to answer moving into Q4 is we really got to see through the spot market first, the health of it. It's kind of one of those things where the canary in the coal mine, because if we start to see a meaningful uptick that is outside of our seasonal expectations or a sustained uptick, then that allows the carriers who are mostly experienced, stuck in the contract space to finally have a little bit of saying, well, can you hook me up? Because right now I just saw your lane posted and it's like $200 more by a broker that you used and you didn't tell me you sent him the loads. And by the way, you kept saying you don't have any product, but by the way, it's over there. Can you give me $200 more? That happens. I've had that happen to me before. It's a fun time, but that's one of the big questions. And so, yeah, we definitely should expect in a perfect world scenario on paper, purely theoretical, that if spot markets continue because capacity who are utilizing this are being taken out of the market, then that should eventually give some good ammunition for some of these RFPs, especially come into Q1 as we're having these conversations. It's really tough right now because the issue of higher cost. And let's say that we do have a statistically significant amount of spot market capacity leave the market. The brokers are going to feel it first. They're usually the ones who are working with it. Optimistically, putting on my carrier hat, what I would really love if I just want to make more money is that the brokers start bailing on the contracted freight first, because now the carriers they use that were sketchballs are out of business. And so now they have to reprice it and hand back the loads. And so we should see an uptick in outbound tender rejection rates. Then they try to tender it over to the contracted carrier. You stand fast. You say, I got 50 a week. I'm not taking your extra 25. We can reprice it as ad hoc. And then I try to make some money. But if that doesn't happen, then, we're probably going to continue to see a situation where especially that 5 to 6%. I'm looking at my internal load balances, thinking about my mix. It's early to tell, but all eyes right now are on the spot market, just because with all this non-domiciled stuff, the largest carriers are generally doing things correctly. If anything, it may impact them a year from now, because some of these changes, especially with the CDLs themselves, if you start hearing results of they're going to revoke some of these non-domiciled CDLs, the problem was let's say I get my work authorization. It's for a year. I'm doing like an H-2B. I'm brought in. I'm legit. Well, I'd be issued a non-domiciled CDL for like 3 years or maybe 5 years. So there's a problem where it's supposed to be the CDL expires when your work documents expire. So that was one of the big things the DOT found out, was you guys are just giving them CDLs, and then some of these drivers are risking it for the biscuit, and they're just going to keep trying to drive, and hopefully they don't get caught. And so those are some of the other changes that are going to add additional wrinkles. So we know structurally the pipeline is like turning down a spigot. Yep. The flow of drivers utilizing these types of CDLs theoretically should slow down. We know this is going to put upward pressure. There's great comments earlier by JB Hunt about the potential upward pressure on wages and competition for good drivers. I would say from working with drivers and managing them, there is always competition for good drivers. The big question is this going to cause a meaningful increase? And if wages go up on these RFPs and this contracted freight, I'm going to have to go back to a customer and say, look, I am hiring better drivers, but I'm competing for them. So,
So the read there for me, especially for a lot of people in this room, we heard Spencer Frazier talk about plan for contingency in 2026. I think that's a foregone conclusion at this point, but the contingency here, in my mind, is avoiding risk. How do you avoid a market that is literally walking itself to the edge? You've got two huge influences going on here in the form of a very, hard environment for a carrier broker to operate in and make money for a 3-year period of time. Then you have the new regulatory practices that are also removing a leg of that chair. So the chair is becoming increasingly wobbly. Well, the thing that's hiding all of this, of course, the demand component being so weak and the extended amount of time that a lot of people have to move goods through the country. If that sense of urgency returns, this will turn the market probably sharply. in some form or fashion. I think for the rest of the year, as Thomas mentioned, the spot market will be, and tender rejection rates are going to give you the earliest warning sign of your deterioration in service and whether or not you need to implement some of that contingency. If you see spot rates, you see tender rejection rates start to really spike up, as they have been doing more often, doesn't mean that you need to start sounding the alarm bell, but it's certainly a sign that we're seeing this is a much more fragile environment than the economics really are showing us right now. Spot rates, you can see they're following a very similar trend line to what tender rejection rates are, which is a slow crawl. If you are priced, or you base a lot of your pricing and your budgets off of that line, the spot market, you're sourcing on the spot market in any way, that is a dangerous place to be. You're saving a bunch of money, but this is the area that is getting attacked right now in terms of capacity the most, it's the most challenged because this is your low cost provider. How many of you ship LTL? All right, the LTL market, this is the story. This is the warning sign. LTL, yellow, the third largest national carrier leaves. What happens to rates? They go up. They didn't go up all the way because LTL is inherently tied to the truckload environment and the truckload capacity that supports the backbone of its network. But rates went up, giving LTL pretty much a pass for about a year from what has been a very challenging transportation environment. That is sort of what we're looking at here, is the low-cost provider, the lower-end service provider is bleeding out, and that is going to potentially, if we see a strong shift, pull it off. So if you're priced around that white line, you're doing okay. You got room. The big read here, though, for those of you in the room that are priced around that white line, is that notice how normally if you have that much spread between these two values, the white line wants to come down towards it because that means there's a lot of competition available. That white line has not been moving over the last year, and it absolutely had reason to move based on the competitiveness of this environment because it's oversupplied. That means there's pricing discipline going on, and a lot of people in this room are not being super aggressive in trying to go after lower end costs on the contract side. Spot side, absolutely. But that is slowly eroding and going away, and it is the most at-risk component of all of this market over the next 12 months, because that's going to be the first place where capacity leaves meaningfully. A lot of the larger operators, they've already that's why they're holding their pricing discipline where they are, because they know they're going to have a little bit more sustainability and viability there, whereas the low end is where a lot of it's bleeding off. Speaking of LTL, I saw a lot of hands in the LTL market that operate in this. This is a very interesting environment for LTL. I came from LTL, and I'm not going to give an LTL lesson or dissertation here, but for those of you that ship LTL, you'll know what classes are. The higher the class, the lighter, the fluffier the freight. It's generally less desirable for carriers. The lower the class, the denser, your stone, rock, sand type freight. What we're seeing in the LTL right now is rates are going up pretty quickly in the higher classes. Those higher class bands are represented in that yellow line that you're looking at there. The pink line is your kind of mid-tier class 70 to 85 band of rates. We're seeing increases there. Majority of the freight that moves in LTL is in that pink line. So when you're reading about Old Dominion getting rate increases and things like that, they're getting them in these higher classes. Where they're not getting them is in the lower classes, the 50s and 60s. So if you have dense, low value freight that you're moving from a manufacturing standpoint, raw materials, et cetera, we're still seeing a pretty competitive space for LTL. And this is also kind of a bifurcation. You've got your low end freight from a carrier perspective that's getting, it's inflationary right now. Your, positive freight for filling up a truck and waiting it out, that's getting a discount. So it's not a uniform environment like we've seen in the past. And that's really the story. Net capacity changes. Thomas, you want to talk about net capacity changes and what the FMCSA, because a lot of people in this room, Carrier Details does some extra work for us here, kind of cleaning up the FMCSA data that's, it's noisy, it's lagged, it's slow. but we're still seeing a pretty decent sign that capacity is leaving the space quickly, correct?
Yeah, I look at this chart like a climate trend. It's not going to tell you if you need to put on a jacket or if it's going to rain that day, but it is going to tell you general trends overall. And so one of the things that we noticed here is you see on the very far right side. So the left side, we had huge amounts of capacity come in, tons of green. We saw the great freight recession that began, and we have all of this red, the great capacity bloodbath. And then at the very far right, we saw some early green shoots with more capacity in terms of unique motor carriers that are entering the market than leaving it. And so that was kind of when we thought, well, things must be getting better, before all the tariffs and the trade-related uncertainties. Well, we're back to more bleeding off. One of the things I want you to pay attention to with this is there are also some additional capacity limiting decisions by the FMCSA in terms of if I want to get a new DOT and a motor carrier number. So if anyone has, how many people have TSA pre-check? Raise your hand. I have it. Okay, yeah. You know how much a pain in the neck that is to get all that and try to get your real ID and your passport and all that stuff? Well, they're making that for carriers now too. So this is cutting off, when we talked about the low-cost, low-quality carriers where I could put like 5 motor carriers in my house. I haven't tried it yet, but I will eventually. Those guys are going to have a hard time because the increased scrutiny and TSA level kind of identity checks means that we're actually cutting off fraudsters. So that's one of the hidden dogs that aren't barking, is that we know they're targeting non-domicile. We know they're targeting the existing driver pool. But for folks who want to launder your motor carrier numbers, because if I'm being a fraudster, I always have 2 or 3 backups, that's going to limit my ability. So yeah, keep an eye on the health of this. We know if you see this little white line that it is kind of, we're reaching that point where we're cutting into the bone. But one of the things I'd like to point out is that just basically the pump fake. You can obviously see the trade-related uncertainties there with the green shoots on the far right. Now we're back into a period. We should continue to see more carriers leave. I'm going to bet $5 on that. You can hit me up on next F3. I may pay it out. But that's going to be one of the key things to watch, because then we know that also the influx of new motor carrier numbers is structurally limited because of the additional identity verification checks, which we had not been seeing before since before April of this year.
Yeah, so if the market turns, it's going to be a lot slower crawl back to regulation. So I'm going to skip through that one. Mike, we did not even get close to breaking down the intermodal market the way that I thought we would. But give us, I think we've got a few minutes left here. I don't know how we are on time, but Mike, give us a high-level intermodal read real quick.
Sure. So this is the domestic intermodal.
Oh, never mind. We're good. Okay.
So this is the domestic intermodal segment. So this is, we heard Spencer Frazier from JB Hunt this morning talk about intermodal market. So this is really the market that he participates in. These are 53-foot containers, and the volume there has been pretty solid. I mean, it's been kind of right in line with last year. In the last week, I think it was down 1%. I was looking at that data this morning, and throughout most of this year, it was flat to up with year ago levels. In the first quarter, it was well above year ago levels. So a little bit of a contrast here, maybe a lot of a contrast between the international segment, where we talked about the international segment earlier, really following import trends. The domestic intermodal segment, there's a portion of that's imports that's transloaded from 40-foot containers into 53-foot containers, but the volume on the domestic side really has not moved the way that that imports have moved, and so it's more evidence that there has been a share shift, particularly in some of these longer haul lanes. I mean, when you take the SONAR data and look at the long haul tender volumes, not just nationwide, but particularly outbound of certain locations like LAX, and then compare those to intermodal volumes, I mean, you're talking about kind of maybe down 5% for intermodal, down maybe 18% for long haul truckload.
Yeah.
So I attribute this to a few things. I mean, the intermodal companies have, the service levels have been pretty solid. They've invested in a lot of containers. The rail companies have invested in a lot of containers as well. So a lot of good things going on here. And I think all of this whole discussion about capacity coming out of the truckload market is just one more thing that's going to help intermodal volume. I mean, you seem to, blame intermodal for truckloads, volume problems to a certain extent. Well, intermodal blames truckload for the pricing situation, or they say, well,
it's both their faults.
Yes, it's each one blames the other to a certain extent. So intermodal saying, well, we can't take pricing up because the truckload pricing is so weak. Well, that may change.
Yeah, too, this represents, if you think about why intermodal is so influential, like I think before the middle of last year, I think a lot of people were talking about how capacity was too abundant. Like there's too many trucks, there's too many, drivers out there. I didn't hear one person talk about the amount of capacity that was available on the intermodal side and all the containers. And this is a reflection of that. And it looks like it's handling the volume. Like as you just mentioned how service hasn't been as big of an issue. And that was the thing that kind of crippled the intermodal service during the pandemic, is that all the log jams around the railheads and the ports, that they didn't have that ease of transition. So my next question there is, we've had a huge announcement this year about the potential merger of this transcontinental railroad, which would be, of course, pretty game changing. I'd like to get your thoughts here on how should everyone in the room think about this moving forward. We're 18 months-ish away from a ruling potentially, but I would like to hear the timeline and how you think that might impact this market.
Yeah, I think the timeline is sort of that 18 months to 2 years. I mean, they're trying to push it forward as quickly as possible. I mean, if I'm looking at this and I'm a shipper and looking at that merger, I'm probably reevaluating my balance of what I move truckload versus intermodal. There may be some lanes that just don't make sense to use intermodal right now. That may make sense if Union Pacific is able to acquire, Norfolk Southern. I mean, you think of intermodal service. Typically it's truckload service plus 1 day.
Right.
But that's if it's strictly on a Western railroad or strictly on an Eastern railroad. If you have to do the rubber tire interchange in Chicago, it's more like truckload plus 3 days. And not only that, it's less time definite, where there's more risk to even hitting that truckload plus 3 days. So there's a lot of goods, in CPG and other things that just doesn't make sense because they need to be on shelves. But if they can make that, closer to parity with truckload. I mean, in a lot of cases, if it does go to Transcontinental Railroad, all they'll have to do is a crew change, in Chicago, and then take the train out. It won't have to be interchanged, and so potentially that's really kind of a game changer. It might be truckload type service, transcontinentally, and so potentially that does present a lot of opportunities for intermodal. There's a lot of origin destination pairs that like Union Pacific called out as having just very little intermodal volume. Like they talked about Dallas to Columbus, both big freight markets. There's not a lot of intermodal volume there because it would have to change railroads. That slows everything down. Right.
And I think we've heard BNSF is now announcing partnerships, and I think the Canadian Pacific as well, or Canadian National.
Yeah, there's been all sorts of partnerships. I think both of them have announced various partnerships, and so that's been kind of the big debate: is do you have to have business combination in order to accomplish the same thing you could do with the partnership? Some say yes, some say no. My sense is there's a lot of benefits to having those under the same umbrella, because if things go wrong, people kind of just divert back to fixing their own organization. Right. It's hard to invest for CFO to invest a lot of capital when it's going to benefit the other company more than his own company, right?
Yeah.
So I think
that's a good point. Like, you think about the inefficiency between two, independent companies. If they're under the same roof, there's inefficiency there too. But certainly, if you have a wall there, I think that's an interesting thing to see play out. Although it's do we think that BNSF and CSX it's Monday, are going to are they working on something in the background? Do you think that's also kind of a play that has a chance?
Warren Buffett says he's not interested. I don't know. Do you believe him or not? CSX has a brand new CEO. He just had his first earnings call. It came from outside the industry. So there's a lot of variables there. It's certainly, for now, it looks like it's partnerships, all the way, but they're going to try to replicate some of those things, I think, via partnerships.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on some tea before we got back into the data. So let's continue to break down. You see the international side here, just collapsing. And this is predictable from the IOTI that we talked about earlier. What does this mean, though, for people in this room? Like, do you care if the international side's kind of fallen off?
I think so. I think it means there's going to be less congestion at some of the terminals and things. So, even if you're just a domestic shipper, you think, well, maybe there's less risk of a service, shutdown. I just saw the material that the guys at Telegraph put out. They did a market overview, and that was, kind of their thought was, usually there's a risk to using intermodal in the fourth quarter because there's lots of volume that could, create service disruptions. I mean, one of the things JB Hunt said on his earnings call is that they do expect a peak season in the fourth quarter, in spite of everything, and that's just because there's large inventories at upstream locations. Those need to be moved downstream. So domestic, there's still plenty of demand there, but I think it reduces the risk of service disruptions to see this come off. And it should be noted, and this is against a very difficult comp from the fourth quarter last year. The railroads are saying, well, there's going to be a share shift at the ports to the eastern ports away from the western ports, and part of that's just the less time sensitivity as well, which causes reduced intermodal volume.
Thomas, do you have?
I had a question. Mike is amazing in terms of explaining the difference between the 40-foot and the 53-foot, especially in terms of intermodal. One of the things that you noticed the rail did a great job of is when we saw that rapid increase in imports hit LA and Long Beach this year, it was like COVID level volumes, but service held, the networks didn't break. One of the things I was curious about, Mike, because we had the previous chart was domestic, right? And then this one's international. What does that kind of tell you about in terms of the imports? Because one of the things I'm trying to understand as well is if the ocean liners feel like there's not a hurry, they'll just send those 40-foot boxes all the way up. Or if they need to turn them and get back, they're going to get them transloaded into 53s, which benefits a lot of these guys. Is that one of the things folks need to watch, especially with the SONAR data, is that 40 to 53-foot interplay? Because it can kind of bite you. We saw in some earnings calls, the size of the trailer matters in intermodal performance.
Yeah, I mean, they're really two distinct markets, and the international market for shippers is a slower service, but it's also a lower cost service. And so when things really, there's plenty of buffer there, they're more likely to use that international intermodal all the way to inland locations. If something is more time definite, they'll move it, they'll transload it into 53-foot containers. It gives them more time to decide where those goods are going, and then they run on the faster domestic intermodal trains. And so that's part of the reason you see in the first half of the year, the international was really strong, even up against a tough comp, from the prior year. So there's a degree of sort of seasonality and just how service sensitive some of these things are. I mean, this is important also for exporters, because on the international side, it's so imbalanced that they have to reposition those containers back to the ports. There's some exporters that will even fill up the containers with grain or other things for exports. It's also one of the things to look at if you're trying to assess, is there excess container availability from the ocean carriers, because if the ocean carriers are concerned about having ocean-going containers that are available, they won't send a lot of those inland on the international intermodal volume. So there's really a lot to be learned and sort of found out from breaking down intermodal between international and domestic. And it's one of the unique things about our data set. Some of the other data sets will just conflate the two.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that the erratic nature here of the international shipping is pretty insane to me. Like this feels like it would be very disruptive, but you're saying that this is actually like things are kind of clearing up congestion wise.
Yeah, I think it's tailed off lately because of the lack of imports. But yeah, earlier in the year, it was going very well, and even then you saw pretty good service, and like Thomas, to your point, I mean, those were some of the all-time record months in July and August at the ports. And because there's been a lot of investment in terminals from a few different angles, both the railroads and the domestic intermodal companies, they were able to handle that.
So
that was a concern for trucking. I like to watch the rail because I also did some stuff earlier in the year reading about Norfolk Southern, talking with them, was that they've invested so much in technology that, and additionally, they're becoming very, very savvy, because there's an entire ecosystem of drayage trucks that basically hang around the railheads. And so that's one of the things that we haven't really heard about, the whole non-domiciled and everything else yet, is the drayage carriers and the rail drays, because there are potentials to see some changes for there. But at the moment, anytime intermodal is doing really really well, trucking is kind of jealously grumbling in the corner because now I'm like, great, now these guys can really handle more stuff. And in this environment now where we have, like we talked with Dr. Zach Rogers with LMI data, there's a lot of stuff just chilling out upstream. I'm not in a hurry. I'm going to slowly matriculate it, waiting on the consumer. So it's definitely a tougher thing to think about from the full truckload segment because you always got to keep an eye on intermodal and even private fleet behaviors to think of your outlook.
Yeah, I kind of want to touch on that a little bit, Thomas, with the trucking side, because drayage obviously tied to these two charts pretty significantly. Have we, either one of you, what are we thinking about drayage and how it's going to be, is it going to be more challenging next year? Is it going to be easier? Are there some inherent risks that we need to be thinking about?
I think there's a risk that could be the choke point. I think there's going to be plenty of containers. I think there's going to be enough capacity in the terminals because there's been a lot of investment there. The drayage companies themselves, I mean, it's a lot of owner operators. It's a lot of companies that kind of organize the owner operators that own their own trucks, logistics companies and those things. Some of the domestic intermodal companies are trying to do more drayage in-house, but still there's a large portion of it that's really fragmented. Some of the ports have suggested that those carriers are not in great shape, financially, even though there has been a lot of volume coming through the ports. So I think if there's a capacity constraint next year, that's one of the possibilities of where it could be.
Are the drayage rates tied to the truckload market rates inherently in any way?
I think it's a different market.
It's usually a turn per box because that's what even in brokerage, you'd make good money, but just doing tons of turns, you make a little bit like 25, 50 bucks on a box. The big challenge is, so on the ports and railheads, you also, think about TWIC cards. And so when we're thinking about the impact of like non-domiciled and stuff, a lot of your average drivers in full truckload for hire space don't really have TWIC cards. Now, the TWIC card's a real pain in the neck to get, but it means you can go to certain spots on ports. And so when we're looking at the outlook on the drayage carriers with all this additional proficiency, I think the ones who are hauling important things that require a TWIC card, they're generally going to be okay because drayage capacity requires a TWIC card. So there's an entire ecosystem dedicated to that. Now, other parts of it, when we're thinking about distribution cycles, I remember think of Port of Savannah and then think of Pooler. You think of the little dray carriers that may be picking up and then maybe some local regional haulers around that to the northern Georgia quadrant. That may be something to watch as well. I know when we're thinking about mileage bands and the types of carriers, this could impact regional carriers. But, at the end of the day, if we start to see an uptick in wages, there's the talk of the automation. I think the drayage space is probably the most at risk even with automation. So in the event there is a huge capacity crunch, it's easier to train a robot yard dog to just go in a small area, like a room this big, and just let them do its thing.
Well, that's where most of the development's been around, correct?
It's three ways. We've got medium duty and we also have heavy duty space. So you've got like a few of them that are doing the yard hostlers or yard dogs, terminal tractors, pejorative terms. And then you have the medium duty box trucks, which some Walmarts, Tyson, and a few others are partnering with. And then we have the heavy duty space. And so it's definitely worth watching. It's kind of a black box just because there's so many little drayage carriers that I like the Genlogs guys. Just you got to find a way to count them. So we'll definitely know when we know, but you really have to wait to see if rates, especially on these box turns, start acting very erratic. And then you'll know that there may be an impact. But yeah, it's so nebulous. It's like trying to find sprinter trucks. It's really something where you have a very special tribal knowledge to deal with the kind of craziness. But once you're in, you're kind of in.
Do we worry about the tariffs? We got a 25% tariff on the trucks now. Are we worried about that having an influence?
So as of this moment, there are some exceptions. The trucks that are UMSA 2, USMCA, NAFTA 2.0 compatible right now, they are not being charged the 25%. So your OEMs like Daimler through Freightliner, which makes a large portion in Mexico. PACCAR is a large global OEM. Their Peterbilt and their Kenworth are largely protected. One's out of Denton, the other one's a combination of Chillicothe, Ohio, as well as parts in Washington. Volvo is made mostly out of Virginia. They're kind of in a good spot, except they have unionized labor, so their costs are going to be a little bit higher. Right now, though, in the next few months, there were some early indications that the Trump administration would clarify, saying that instead of the entire truck, the NAFTA 2.0 parts that aren't made in the U.S. are going to get taxed at 25%, but we're going to give you this rebate, so somehow it's going to be okay. The answer is maybe.
Maybe. That was a lot.
We'll know when we know.
For an uncertainty. That I'm going to coin that term and try to trademark it this year, uncertainty. So we are going to pause here in a few minutes for questions. So think about questions if you've got them. But in the meantime, Mike, you talked about the length of haul. The long haul. We we know that the transcontinental freight, I don't even think I finished my thought earlier about why intermodal has such a big influence, outsized influence on truckload capacity, in the sense that when you talk about long haul freight, 800-mile loads, which is what the LOTVI is measuring out of Los Angeles here, that is 4 days for a truck going from Los Angeles to Chicago. That's 4 days of capacity for a truck and a driver. Whereas if you're looking at a load that's tendered for 100 miles, that's a portion of a day. It's not the same influence to capacity. And keep in mind that Los Angeles is an island, an oasis for freight in the middle of a freight desert, where there is not a lot of population. You got to cross the mountains for 2,000 miles, and there's just not a lot going on in Albuquerque. Sorry, Kaylee Nix, New Mexico resident. So it is a huge deal when we start talking about loss of volume coming off of the West Coast moving east. It means that carrier networks have to then shift to be more East Coast centric and not reposition their capacity out there. It takes days to do such a journey. And it's not very cost effective to drive across the mountains, especially in the winter. So Mike, what are we thinking here? Like, is there something like, is this kind of permanent that we're talking about? In terms of
intermodal gaining
yeah.
market share from long haul, I think that the railroads are looking at their portfolio of business and saying, well, they have to have some way to grow the revenue. Yeah. I mean, and the rest of their revenue segments are not growth areas. I mean, right. Coal, grain. I mean,
but that's where they make money. Most of the money, right?
That's true. And intermodal is not one of their higher margin segments. It's at best in the middle.
So all of a sudden they get tired of intermodal. And they get a bunch of coal. Does that influence and keep some of the service and capacity offline?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're different. They're different networks. I think they know that the coal is a secular decliner, sure. Even though there are times where you have a hot summer, cold winter, or there's demand for overseas to move coal, and it can be kind of a mini surge. You saw some of that this year. But I think the railroads are looking at intermodal and saying, well, this is kind of the one way they can grow revenue. There's only so much cost they can take out, right. Despite what some of these activist investors, think. But their margins are already really high. CSX is maybe the one that has some work to do there. Listen to their earnings call. It was almost like, I can't tell you how many times he referenced they were going to be best in class, in one way or another, I think including operating ratio. So, but for the most part, their margins are about as good as they can be. And intermodal is the one way they can kind of grow volume. And I think there's going to be continue to be a lot of investment there, both by the railroads and the domestic intermodal companies sort of working closely together. Right.
Let's talk about pricing. Intermodal, of course, lower cost in general. However, a lot of our rates are door to door, the way that we look at them. What are we seeing here in terms of a structural change? You just talked about how intermodal was complaining about a pricing problem, which we've talked about for over a year now, in the way that, it's been a share game. They can grab the volume, but it also helps keep rates down. Is that changing?
Yeah, I do think the truckload rates are keeping the intermodal rates down because those are always competitive to a certain extent. I mean, they're more competitive in some lanes than others. We recently rolled out a new dashboard in SONAR called the intermodal. I guess it's intermodal dashboard. So we put all the sort of the most sort of high level data points on there, and in addition, took the lanes that we have produced intermodal contract rates for, which is 67 lanes, which covers about half of the total volume on the domestic network. Took those rates, including fuel surcharge, compared those to truckload, including fuel surcharge, and produced contract rate savings for all these dense lanes. And typically you think of intermodal as saving maybe 10 to 15% versus truckload. A lot of these major lanes, we're getting savings rates of more than that, 20%, 30%, some cases a little bit higher. Just looking at this LA to Chicago, 35%. I mean, that's a lane that's really an intermodal lane. It shouldn't be terribly competitive with truckload unless there's something that's really service sensitive. Right. So, I look at this and I say, well, shippers are, there's a good value proposition there, considering that the service levels have been adequate. There's a significant pricing spread. At least for now. I mean, you could have a snowstorm in Chicago, and that could change things. But
Right.
most of our data suggests I think there's a good value proposition for intermodal.
Right on. All right, I think we've got, what, about 5 to 10 left? 10? I'll pause for questions just to make sure we get to them. Sometimes there's a lot, but are there any questions so far? Go ahead.
Yes. If you can run it well, yes.
Yeah.
Because as much as I came from pure play for hire, I did US Express Enterprises. Private fleets are definitely, when you look at your total mix, that's going to be the key. But one of the things to pay attention to is when we start to see, and I do believe there will be some slight pullback as we look at a DC to DC kind of scenario where we find out which ones are more expensive. And that's when you hear commentaries like Werner and Hunt and other ones when they say we're making inroads towards dedicated, because even at the largest level, less than half of a large carrier's truckload base is going to be OTR or one way. So dedicated is kind of circle the wagons, and it's a very predictable, longer contracts. So yeah, I do think, right now is a good environment for a win-win. You either look at growing your own private fleet, or you also start benchmarking and getting competitive in the for-hire fleets because they're very hungry right now. They're scared. They've been parking trucks idle because over the road is crapping the bed. There's a really good opportunity if you're trying to figure out a good scheme to make that work. Definitely would say private fleets. And the technology is getting a lot better. These fleets are now having better skills to run that and manage their costs, when before it was more of you needed that tribal knowledge. The recent 2 or 3 years have made it a lot better with the data.
Yeah, from a pure market perspective, because I'll jump on what Thomas said, if you do it well. From a pure market perspective, now's the time to kind of invest in that, because you're hitting where trucks are going to be lower cost if you can get away from the tariffs. Lower cost, you're going to be able to kind of like start building yourself before the market flips meaningfully. And you'll be ready. You'll be ready for the turn. So it's a little bit of a hedge. And that's what you want to think about it like, it's a portfolio hedge. Do you want it to cover the entirety of the market? Absolutely not at any point in time. That's why the for-hire carriers exist and the brokers exist. You do not want to be in the trucking business, is what I would always tell people, is as long as it's serving a nice little niche component that is covering your highest value transportation, that's what you want to focus on, because trucking is not as straightforward as a lot of people think it is. And watching out for that operational, you see these guys make 5 cents on the dollar in a good market. So that is a cost center to you, purely. Anyone else?
So those are 53-foot containers. Well, there's still a lot of containers that need to be repositioned, that are being repositioned, back. So, I'm not sure if that would be what was causing it or not. Because it seems like there's still, I guess on the international side, there would be fewer containers being repositioned back to the West Coast. But, there are some on the 53-foot side that are still being, repositioned when we look at how many empties, but not in as high a volume as has been before. But yeah, it's something that we can look at on SONAR on a lane by lane basis to see, how just the volume of empty containers that are being repositioned. But, I wouldn't think so off the top of my head, but it's something I could look up for you on the system. Okay.
Go ahead. Yes. Right. For sure. No, I talk to Dr. Rogers literally every month about this. So it's the LMI, for those of you that don't know, it's a diffusion index where they survey over 300 companies, supply chain professionals, and ask them questions around transportation and warehousing primarily. And the components that are inverted that you're talking about, they're the transportation and I think it's the capacity and the price change lines. So you can see that this data actually lines up very, very well with the markets flipping. Like back in the pandemic, prices are up, capacity's down. And that's an inflationary signal. What is happening right now, over the last year, we were actually seeing prices exceed this capacity for about an 8-month-ish period, but it was very marginal. It was like a marginal exception. The way I read this index, though, is that's sort of what we've seen in the market, in the way that prices have, especially on the spot market, have been creeping slightly higher. This index would suggest that we have stalled out and capacity and prices are almost in an equilibrium. And that's also sort of what we've seen. But also keep in mind, this is a survey from supply chain professionals, transportation managers. From their perspective, capacity has grown. They don't have a view of outside their walls. So keep that in mind. This is like my perspective is I was able to get more capacity this month versus last month. So from their mind, capacity expanded. Prices came down because they were able to get it better. And it's just a marginal amount. And you got to be very careful because there's a little nuance in the survey. This gets a little bit more in the weeds, not this one specifically, but the tender data is an operational, like this is a measure of, just think about the data for what it is. And that is a pure, I'm going to take this load or not. Carriers not taking loads means that they have something else financially that's going on that's making it better for them. And I did have the LMI for the inventory levels, but any questions? But in terms of how fast a carrier pays of a carrier, and I'll let.
Yeah, I think so. John Kingston, he's one of our writers. He's here in the audience as well. He writes about BMO, one of the lenders, kind of financial health. Canada has a large exposure to trucking in terms of loans. Triumph and a few others, payment processors. You're probably going to look at some of their commentary just to see if the carrier is asking for a net 7, a net 15, and net 30. That's bad, in my opinion. Normally, a carrier, if you've got enough cash flow, you're used to a net 30, a net 45, and a 60. Then you start your account aging past 60, and if you get to 120, you need to ask, what's this customer doing? And then you stop servicing their freight until they pay you. But yeah, there's not an index of how fast are people getting paid yet. It is something that theoretically you could put together, which is the kind of a sentiment analysis of how screwed. But yeah, I would say BMO data, we kind of report on that. And then usually the large ones like Triumph and a few others probably is the best bet to see the financial health, or factoring companies too. If you see some large publicly traded factors, because they're going to be the first ones that are going to start noticing if their customers are having problems because they're trying to collect from upfront as well. They're kind of the litmus test on credit worthiness.
Yeah, and I believe the last couple of reports from BMO, it's kind of like peaked and stalled out. It actually came down a little bit in terms of health of a carrier, but that's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean things got meaningfully better for a carrier. But yeah, anytime, net 7, I mean, everybody wants 7-day terms, but nobody's going to, I mean, it's probably not a great signal, but most carriers, are in that 30 to 40-day range is where they try to target the net sales outstanding, days outstanding. So it's clearly a cash flow game right now for a lot of these guys, and that's even for very solid carriers. So it doesn't shock me that you're seeing, because that's the rates. When I showed you the rates chart and how flat it's been, even though rates should have come down, that's a sign that these guys are operating below cost in a lot of situations. So there's not really a good, like, it's not a good market at all for any carrier, really. It's just how have they navigated their cost structure through it. Anybody else? On the refrigerated side, we're actually seeing more volatility. But it's the refrigerated market I could talk about it for an hour by itself. It has had its own seasonal shift after the pandemic, where we've seen this weird lull in the spring and this peak in the fall. But those peaks are getting stronger and the volatility is getting higher, even though it's marginally. So it's very related to the dry van market. Flatbed, on the other hand, appears to be relatively flat, for lack of a better word. It's actually not as volatile as it's been. We saw this big bubble early in the year with the tariffs around the domestic USMCA, a lot of the Mexico and Canada stuff. We saw manufacturing. It was a lot of pull forward there as well. But flatbed's kind of the one that's moving independently of the other two right now. But to answer your question, van and reefer are very connected. Reefer just has more volatility and sensitivity in it.
And they're like 11%, 10 to 11%. They're in a good spot compared to dry van. So if you ever see reefer really dip below, then they start trying to mooch off the dry van market, try to get under 42,000 pounds. But yeah, flatbed and reefer have been, I think flatbed's around 9% right now in the contract
which
space.
Is really, really low.
That's, by their standards, it's really low compared to dry van. I wish I had 10% because then I can really start to see a routing guide failure. But yeah, they're in a much better position, but they are smaller and more volatile. But the spot rates, that's the interesting thing. Yeah.
Spot rates are doing the exact same thing. Refrigerated's leading the way with the highest rates, but they're naturally more costly. And flatbed coming below it, though, over the last month and a half-ish is unusual. We good? All right. Well, thank you all. I'll turn it back over to Kaylee.